everybody. We're going to do Kings chapter 11 in the Kings study. If you remember all the way back, it's been a while, but when I did the introduction to Kings, First Kings, we said how it covers the history of the kings, but the majority of the book really covered Solomon's rule. And so, but now in this chapter, we're going to begin to see the division. In the history of the Old Testament, you have the division of Israel. And throughout the Old Testament, sometimes the references are to Israel, but sometimes now it's going to refer to the 10 northern tribes, because there's a division at this point. And the southern tribes are Judah, and they're going to remain under the son of Solomon, which we're going to read about in the last verse, the last few verses, and the man by the name of Jeroboam, who 10 parts of the kingdom go to him. So in the history of kings, this is the chapter where the kingdom now is going to be rent. And why? In this chapter, Solomon, we read the history of all of his wives. Okay, there's a little dispute. Was it actually 1,000? 700 wives, 300 concubines. There's about 1,000 women that Solomon loved, it says. And when Solomon got old, which God had forbidden the children of Israel to marry into these other families outside of Israel. And it was forbidden because of the mistake that's going to be made in this chapter by Solomon himself. He loved other women, and then it says when he got old, he began also being influenced by pagan deities. Okay, Moloch, Chemosh. These are gods of Amorites and Moab, and the god, the Ashtaroth. Okay, in Greek it's, I think, Astartes. Now these other false gods, pagan gods, and what we would understand like demon gods, Solomon actually he builds altars to them, one on the foot of Jerusalem, which was God's sanctified place at that time, where the temple was. And so this draws them away, and Solomon's heart is drawn away. So the judgment now is, God raises up two men, Hadad and Rezon, R-E-Z-O-N, and these men are thorns now in the side of Solomon. The Apostle Paul says in the New Testament, there was a thorn in his flesh, the messenger of Satan sent to buffet him. And some teachers have different views on what was Paul's thorn in the flesh. Was it eye problems or whatever? But he does actually say it was a messenger of Satan sent to buffet him. And Paul, it says, besought the Lord 3 times that it would depart. And God said, my grace is sufficient for thee. My strength is made perfect in weakness. Now these two men, Hadad, it's a kind of a little interesting. Most commentators don't really spend a lot of time on him because he's an Edomite. And he simply is one of the adversaries that's going to rise up in this chapter as God's judgment. But if you look at the little story in that chapter, you see almost the same type of thing that happened with Moses, in the sense that there was a time in the history when we covered a little bit of Moses, there were people, the young kids were being slaughtered, but Moses supernaturally is protected by God. And the mother of Moses, instead of the male child being killed, puts him in a little basket, and sure enough, the daughter of Pharaoh, in the story of Moses, brings him up, and he's brought up in the house of Pharaoh in Egypt. Hadad, who is an Edomite. Now, the Edomites were some people that were being wiped out by David's kingdom. And Joab, who we've covered already, he actually spent time wiping out all the Edomites. cover that history that's in this chapter. But there was a young boy that was an Edomite, whose name was Hadad, and he managed to escape. And if you read the chapter, then he gathers some men unto him, sort of like even King David when he was on the run from Saul. Then he winds up getting protection in Egypt, because obviously David and Joab at the time were wiping out his entire line of people, the Edomites. But one survived. And it was in the purpose of God that all the enemies were not wiped out, because God knew he was going to raise this man Hadad up down the road. And it says Hadad was brought up. Pharaoh really loved Hadad, and even gave him the sister of his own wife, one of his wives, Taphanes, and let them marry Hadad. And so it was kind of, he had a child, Ganuba, I think, not significant. But he had the same training, all the wisdom. It says in Hebrews 11, Moses benefited from the education that he got when he was brought up in Pharaoh's household. And so Hadad kind of has this. And then when Hadad heard that David and Joab were dead, he went to Pharaoh and said, it's time for me to go back to my own people. And Pharaoh says, but I've been good to you all this time. What do you want to leave? He says, I just need to go. Because God was calling this man to become now an adversary to unrighteous government, even within Israel, which was Solomon. See, even if people are Christians, and then they begin doing unrighteously in positions of authority, God raises up adversaries. So, Hadad is one, and Rezon is another one. But also God raises up somebody. There has to be someone, if the kingdom is going to be divided, which it is, God is not going to allow someone that is not from the tribes of Israel to have part of Israel. He's going to have someone from within one of the tribes. And there's a man by the name of Jeroboam. Jeroboam actually was one of the good workers under Solomon. It says Jeroboam was an industrious man, and Solomon put him in charge of some stuff. But then one day Jeroboam's out by himself, and he runs into a prophet by the name of Ahijah. And Ahijah has this new garment. As you read the chapter, it's not real clear whether this new garment is on Ahijah or Jeroboam, but it's on Ahijah. Okay? If you read other versions, it'll show you that. So, Ahijah is this prophet. And when he runs into Jeroboam one day out in the field, he takes this new garment that he has on him, and he rips it into 12 pieces. And he says to Jeroboam, we read kind of a prophecy by a man by the name of Agabus as we keep going through the book of Acts, that kind of, sometimes the prophets, even in the New Testament, did things that were like signs, parables. It's the way God speaks as well, okay? So Ahijah says to Jeroboam, the kingdom's going to be ripped away from Solomon, and you're going to take 10 pieces of it, the 10 northern tribes. You know, in the New Testament, Jesus talks about those that were faithful. And in one of the parables, in one of the teachings, he says, and you will get 10 cities. You've been faithful over a little bit. Now I give to you 10 cities, places. I believe that's 10, but that's the theme of one of the parables. So Jeroboam realizes that he had no plan on, mounting the rebellion. The chapter really doesn't talk about that. Some scholars think maybe there was another. But either way, the prophet simply said, God wants to do something in his people. Now the history of this chapter and the history of the Old Testament, it almost follows somewhat of the storyline of the history of the church. Because the tribes of the north under Jeroboam, these people are going to be considered later on sort of like more pagan, worse in their religious worship, adopting practices that were worse. though Solomon himself has introduced some of this idolatry into the people of God. But Judah, the history going now from this point throughout the whole Old Testament, the history is going to be the 10 northern tribes are going to really kind of get worse in their understanding of religious practice. And Judah is going to begin, God permits Solomon to have Judah, which are going to be referred to as the southern tribes, under his son at the end, Rehoboam. So we're going to read about this in the next chapter when I teach it. But Judah in the Old Testament begins seeing, wait a minute, we are closer to you, God, than these 10 northern tribes, which are going to stray further. And there's rebukes from the prophets in the Old Testament that says to the southern tribes, you think you're more doctrinally perfect than your other brothers and sisters, and yet you're just as bad. And in the history of the church, I had some books, I gave them away, but when I covered the whole history of Christianity, we do have a tremendously great time during the Reformation. And when I teach Renaissance in the 16th century, how Martin Luther and the great reformers, we called them the magisterial reformers, John Calvin, Derwick Zwingli. I stood in Lake Geneva, Switzerland, many years ago, and they had the statue of Zwingli. Now, they had some of those guys had some problems. Zwingli drowned the Anabaptists. You're talking 1500s now. We're not in this Old Testament story now. It's different time, obviously. But what happened in the history of Christianity was because of the divisions, because of the Reformation, many Protestants, because they did get back to Scripture and back to the Word of God, many then started viewing we are so much more doctrinally pure than our other Catholic, Orthodox. And in a sense, yes, it was true, because the Protestants did indeed get back to Scripture, and I believe in the doctrine of justification by faith, and I taught Paul's great letters on it, which are Romans and Galatians. But then there came a time where, in the history of the Old Testament, though the southern tribes are going to be actually more doctrinally pure, the prophets begin saying, but you're just as bad. You're looking at your other majority tribes, because that's what they're going to start doing later on. And you're condemning them, but your heart is just as bad. Your heart is just as gone far. So God, through the prophet Ahijah, takes Jeroboam and says, you're going to get part of the tribe. Solomon gets word of this and goes and tries to kill him. Remember when we talked about how Solomon took the throne under David, where Solomon is known for his wisdom, but he was pretty ruthless in understanding how he was going to wipe out the tribes or the people that were adversaries to him. So Jeroboam also, I think he flees into Egypt as well. And judgment now comes to God's people. I might read a few verses. Prophet Ahijah, Jeroboam flees to Egypt. In the end of the chapter, Solomon dies. That's a note I wrote. Solomon dies, and he reigned 40 years. All of his acts, I can read a few of them. It's written in a book, which actually we don't have, but later one of the writers uses the book that's mentioned at the end of, and the rest of the acts of Solomon and all that he did. This is 1 Kings 11. And his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the acts of Solomon? And Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over Israel for 40 years, and Solomon slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David his father. And Rehoboam his son reigned in his stead. And then we're going to read about how Jeroboam did. Next chapter is going to show how the kingdom actually was divided. And let me read a few verses. King Solomon loved many strange women, together with the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and of the nations concerning which the Lord said unto the children of Israel, you shall not go into them, neither shall they come into you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. And Solomon clave unto these in love. We have the Song of Solomon. It's a romantic and erotic book, actually, and we do have that in the Old Testament. Solomon had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. And his wives turned away his heart. And then, again, in the next verse, verse 4, his heart went after these guys, and his heart was not perfect. It was a matter of the heart. And Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, and went not fully after the Lord, as David his father did. And the Lord stirred up an adversary unto Solomon, Hadad the Edomite, who I just talked to you about. Then Pharaoh said unto him, let me look. And the man Jeroboam was a mighty man of valor. And Solomon, seeing the young man that he was industrious, he made him ruler over all the charge of his house. And it came to pass at that time, when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem, that the prophet Ahijah, the Shilonite, found him in the way, and he had clad himself with a new garment. And they two were alone in the field, and Ahijah caught the new garment that was on him, rent it in 12 pieces. And he said to Jeroboam, Take thee 10 pieces, for thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, Behold, I will rend the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon, and will give you 10 tribes. Verse 36, And unto his son, God says, I will leave one tribe unto the son of David, which was Solomon. One tribe is going to remain under the hand of Rehoboam, that David my servant may have a light always before me in Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen to put my name. And I will take thee, and thou shalt reign according, this is Jeroboam, all thy soul desires, and you will be king over all Israel. And it will be, now this is the instruction to Jeroboam, same type of instruction to David and to Solomon. It shall be, if you will hearken unto all that I command thee, and walk in my ways, and do that which is right in my sight, to keep my statutes and my commandments, as David my servant did, then I will be with thee, and I will build you a sure house, as I built for David, and will give Israel unto thee, which is the requirement to rule as a king. I've got a verse up here. Prepare mercy and truth, which may preserve me. David, Solomon's father, he was a warrior, but he was also a just man. And he always leaned on the side of mercy. And when we covered, I mentioned Joab again in this chapter. There were times where Joab, the military man, the solution that the military men usually see is military action, okay? Because that's how they're trained. I'm not saying all generals and all are bad or wicked, but when you say, in our country at this time, in any particular presidency, if you say, I'm going to let the generals make decisions, generals and military men, good men, but their mindset, West Point graduates, is how to effectively wage war, that's what they're trained for. But the political decisions on whether or not you should do it, that's really not up to generals to make those decisions. Presidents or leaders could say, if we have to go into a certain place and engage in action, then how we're going to do it. You give me a plan to do it. But you don't ever leave it up to them, because it's in them to engage. It's in them because that's what they're trained for. And Joab was the type of man that felt like the solution was wipe out all your enemies. And there were times where David had disagreements with Joab, which we covered already. And David would say things like, you're a bloody man, Joab. Okay, so we'll do this quick. We'll end Kings. We've covered a lot of the history so far. We're going to finish Kings, First Kings, and just a few points for leadership. Sometimes, in this case, sometimes the people that are thorns in your side are sent by God. I just talked a little bit about Paul, who referred to it as a messenger of Satan that God permitted. Sometimes the Pontius Pilate we're covering and teaching Mark. Others that were actually made bad decrees and just decrees. We talk about the crucifixion. But, of course, Jesus understood that even in all of that, that was the purpose of God. And Paul again in Corinthians says, if the rulers of this world knew what was going to happen when they plotted against Jesus, they would have never crucified the Lord of glory. And Satan has blinded even their minds at times. So one of the lessons from this chapter would be, the problem Solomon had wasn't with Hadad, Rezin, or Jeroboam. The problem he had was with his heart. His heart did not fully go after God. And that opened up the door. And Solomon, obviously, we read of his death at the end of the chapter. But these men, particularly Jeroboam, is now going to be, there's going to be an adversarial relationship between Rehoboam, who is the son of Solomon, and Jeroboam, who is an Ephraimite. But yet at the same time, the line of Solomon, the line of David, the prophet himself would say, the reason the whole kingdom is not going to be rent completely from Solomon and his son, God says, because of David. Because I made a promise to your father David one day that a son will always sit on the throne. You'll always have a son on the throne from your line. And of course we know that's fulfilled now through Jesus Christ. The root and the offspring of David, the bright morning star. Okay? God bless everybody.